I thought I would read this. It's kind of an interview with a street beggar. Mexico City has one of the greatest gaps between rich and poor. We probably have 80% of the population living in poverty and another 17% in the middle class and maybe 3% above that, and a tiny, tiny handful of people that actually have large amounts of money. So this is about one of the poorest peoples in Mexico City and one of the richest. It's called Orlando's Bones. I miss Orlando. Every Sunday morning on my way to La Blanca, he would be huddled up against the wall of La Profesa Church, reading from torn scraps of newspapers he had rescued from trash cans here in the Centro. He seemed particularly interested in the football. On Sundays, Don Vicente, who runs the newspaper kiosk in front of the cafe, would slip Orlando Esto, the sports tabloid, that he would study intensely all week. Vicente thinks he rooted for the Toluca Red Devils. I called Orlando mi lector, my reader, and when he saw me coming on Sunday morning, a wide smile that warmed my morning coffee would break across his filth-caked features. Orlando couldn't talk, and he had a hard time saying words in a way that others could understand him. He dragged himself around the Centro Histórico, eating out of garbage bins outside the McDonald's and the Burger King and the Kentucky Fried Chicken that do land office business down here. Once, when Orlando had taken up residence in the little landscape garden outside the Telmex offices on the next block, he showed me what he had scavenged that day: 2 mostly eaten Big Macs, a gnawed chicken leg, a handful of stiff ketchup-flecked French fries, and rubbed his greasy belly in delight. Telmex is owned by Carlos Slim, the richest man in the world. Orlando was one of the poorest. He lasted only a couple of nights in Carlos Slim's garden. When I went by there the next day to check on him, the Telmex security guards were cleaning up the mess he'd left behind and cussing him out. Most passerbys stepped around the filthy, crippled man as he sprawled on the public sidewalk. Some good souls on their way to work or mass or morning coffee dropped coins near him, but were reluctant to put them in his blackened hands. He stank ferociously. Orlando was probably not even his name. I once asked him what he was called, and the word that came out sort of sounded like Orlando, so I always greeted him that way, and he would grunt happily in return. Then one Sunday morning, Orlando spoke. Andrés Manuel López Obrador had just been robbed of the Mexican presidency in July 2006, and there was a huge protest in the Zócalo. On the way back to the hotel, I ran into him crawling up, Isabella Católica on his hands, and we saluted each other. I handed him a coin, and he smiled beatifically, and to my total amazement stated very clearly that he was the president of Mexico. Yo soy el presidente. I never heard him talk again. Orlando had no fixed address. Sometimes I would see him lying on the sidewalk outside the busy Paris pharmacy on El Salvador Street, or soaking up the morning rays on a chilly winter day against the wall of the ex-National Library across from my rooms. I worried about him a lot and was always finding old sweaters for him. One Sunday, a few months ago, he didn't show up at La Profesa Church. Vicente said Orlando hadn't come in for his newspaper. There are always a handful of beggars hanging around outside the church. I think the priest feeds them on Sunday morning, and churchgoers are always good for a few coins, but they hadn't seen him either. The next Sunday morning, Orlando wasn't there either. Ramon, the old guy who parks cars for Mass, hadn't seen him all week. Neither had the priest. The third Sunday morning, it was raining hard, and there was no one outside La Profesa to ask, so I went looking for Orlando. I searched out his old haunts on Salvador and Cinco de Febrero streets. Nada. I checked the alley behind La Risa Pulqueria, where the homeless sometimes encamp. Nada. The trail grew cold. Fearing the worst, I stopped asking for Orlando. He had simply vanished into the maw of El Monstruo, and the monster hadn't even bothered to spit back his bones. So
Wow.
that's life in a big city.
Wow. John Ross. That was John Ross reading from his book, El Monstruo, Dread and Redemption in Mexico City, his second home, your first home being somewhere in the U.S., probably Greenwich Village, New York. Do you claim it?
Well, that's where I'm from.
You're
but
from there.
I'm much more aligned with folks in San Pancho, California, and up there in good old Humboldt County, sending it out for those folks.
Yes. Hello to Humboldt County. And thank you for doing what you do.
Okay.
I asked my partner and co-host and amigo bueno, Michael James, to join us because we're surrounded today in honor of John's visit and being in between our art shows on the wall with Michael's photography exhibit of his photos taken in 1962 in Mexico City, which are quite remarkable, particularly when Michael puts them together with some of his more recent photos. You've got a good eye, Michael. You always have. You brought us John Ross somehow. So it's fitting that you two should be around this table and I should be right in the middle of you. What does it mean for you to have John here, have your photos on the wall, just that whole continuity thing?
Well, John is quite a guy, and I think my first connection to John came through my friends down in El Paso, Bobby Bird and Russ Bradbird. You know, they say he was quite a basketball player. He wrote some basketball poetry. When John and I got to know each other over the years and talked more, we found like we did a lot of things, or we knew people in common. We've been to a lot of the same places. But his book on Mexico City did inspire me to pull. You know, I have a lot of clutter in the back, and I pulled together just the photos from Mexico City, not from the overall series Mexico '62. And I didn't even get all the Mexico City ones, but John was looking at them yesterday and saying things don't really look like this anymore.
Well, it's a time capsule, definitely, you know, and finding old film like that is, I was looking at, when I was writing this book, I was looking at lots of old photos, lots of old films shot back in the 50s and the 60s. Things really don't look like that anymore, but those were great days for Mexico. Those were, you know, that's kind of what the nostalgia that people of my generation look back at. So the pictures themselves, to me, kind of come out of the time capsule. And the fact that you took them way back then and then just developed them a bunch of years ago is really, you know, kind of illuminates that part of the history of the Monstruo.
Well, it's been a good ride with these pictures. I've had the exhibit up a number of places, and I actually have sold a number of the Kennedy shots. You know, Kennedy, it turns out, in 1962, when I drove my motorcycle, my Triumph, down to Mexico to go to college, I was not that radical. I was moved by the civil rights movement. Kennedy was still probably sort of a hero to me. In reading your book, it's clear to me that the guy in my picture with Kennedy, the president, Lopez Mateos, he had made sure there were no radicals around.
Right.
You know, I have a whole series of these pictures of people kind of waiting for Kennedy. And I did find one that has something scribbled on the wall that's anti-Kennedy, but it's been kind of cleaned off, which is not hanging up. But I did see, in your book, you talk about the communists and the pro-Castro, pro-Cuba people were really squashed from coming out when Kennedy was there. But in driving down to Acapulco with some fellow students for some reveille, I remember seeing in Guerrero all these rocks with paintings on that would say "Viva Comunismo," "Viva Castro," "Capitalismo no." So clearly that was, for me, a signal that there was something else going on in the world.
Well, it was only 3 years after the Cuban Revolution, 1962. So, you know, Mexico was caught up in the ferment from the revolution, very strong pro-Cuba movement in Mexico. And not only Lopez Mateos, but the mayor of Mexico City, Ernesto Villoro, the Iron Regent, as he was called, made sure that there were no protesters on the street.